Hi everyone, welcome back to All Around the World. Today I will be reading the book St. George.
All around the world, all around the world, all around the world, all around the world.
St. George, written and illustrated by Robert E. Barry. This is the story of St. George who wanted to be a knight. Here is St. George, a most unusual fellow. He did not want to be a fireman or a policeman or even a space cadet like most of his friends. No, that was not for him. St. George wanted to be a brave and bold knight. Now we all know that every knight has a shining suit of armor. So St. George said, "I too must have a shining suit of armor," and saying this, proceeded to make the shiniest suit of armor in all the land. But what of that? Thought St. George. I am still not a brave and bold knight. Then he remembered that every knight has his own fine garden, so St. George said, "I too must have such a garden," and saying this, proceeded to grow the finest garden in all the land. But St. George was not at all pleased, for he was still not a brave and bold knight. Everyone knows that a knight lives in a splendid castle, so St. George said, "I too must live in such a castle," and saying this, he proceeded to build the finest castle in all the land. It was indeed a splendid castle, but St. George was still not satisfied. He knew very well that he was not yet a brave and bold knight. Then, suddenly, a most wonderful thought flew into his head. "Knights slay terrible dragons. I too shall slay a terrible dragon." Now it so happened that not far from the castle there lived a terrible dragon in the midst of a great and dark forest. So on that very day St. George rode forth to slay this terrible dragon. Here is the terrible dragon who lived in the dark forest. See what frightful flames he breathes. Such flames might persuade anyone else to put off this dragon chasing for a day or two, but not St. George. He was determined to slay this dragon and had a wonderful plan with which to do it. He did not use his sword or his spear or even his long-pointed lance. Instead, St. George used a vessel full of water. Who but St. George could have thought of this? But, alas, this dragon was much too big and terrible to slay with only one vessel of water. Poor St. George was obliged to leave in great distress, sore and hurt with the fire. St. George, however, was not at all discouraged. He was indeed an unusual fellow. He could forget such unpleasant and distressing events with a wondrous ease. Here he is again, already on the trail of another terrible dragon. Indeed, St. George has found another dragon. But alas, this dragon is even bigger and more terrible than the first. Who can blame St. George for retreating in such haste? No wonder he has forgotten to use his sword, or his spear, or his long-pointed lance. Amazing! St. George's distress has already passed quite out of his head. But what nonsense is this? Here he is, laying a path of sweet apples picked from the tree in his own fine garden. Has St. George at last discovered a way to catch a terrible dragon? Well, what a delightful turn of events! St. George has captured what appears to be a most terrible dragon. If this dragon fellow had thought something other than, "Very good apples these, I don't know when I've tasted better," he might not have been caught. But there he is, nevertheless, caught and soon to be slain. As soon, that is, as St. George discovers just how one goes about slaying a terrible dragon. And how does one discover how to slay a terrible dragon? Why, one simply asks a friend, or so St. George has been told. But when St. George asked his friends the sheep, they could only look at him in amazement and say, "Why, we've never slain a terrible dragon. These sheep, it seems, are good for little more than growing warm winter coats." Meanwhile, the terrible dragon is not quite sure what to make of all this. In fact, he is still thinking, "Very good apples those. I don't know when I've tasted better." St. George's friends the fish are no better informed. One might even say they are good for nothing more than frying in a hot, buttered pan. Here they are, looking at St. George as only fish can, and saying, "Why, dear friend, we've never slain a terrible dragon." The dragon, incidentally, has just discovered St. George's fine garden of sweet apples and is making short work of it. Surely one of St. George's feathered friends will know something of dragons and how to slay them. But no, these birds, it seems, know little more than how to fly south at the first sign of a chill. They can only exclaim,
"Why, we've never dreamed of slaying a dragon."
This terrible dragon, by the way, is still thinking, "Very good apples, these. I don't know when I've tasted better," and is even licking his chops over his good fortune. It seems that no one knows how to slay a terrible dragon, least of all St. George. There is only one thing to do with a dragon who is good for little more than eating sweet apples, and that is to get rid of him. St. George has already set about it. He has the dragon by the tail and is pulling and pulling and pulling. But this scoundrel of a dragon has grown so fat eating sweet apples that he can't be budged. What to do now? Well, one only has to remember what a remarkable fellow is St. George. There he sits, looking just like a brave and bold knight. Hurrah for St. George! He is a brave and bold knight at last. There he goes, riding forth to seek adventure, dragon, castle, garden, and all. As for our dragon friend, well, he is still thinking, "Very good apples, those. I don't know when I've tasted better." The end.
Thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you next time.